But welcome, everyone. My name is Leanne Ahlstrom, and I'm the Minister Representative from the Faithful Green Actions team. I'm just wanting to open this evening's gathering with a land acknowledgement. So bear with me one moment as I get my notes. We acknowledge this evening that we are worshiping on the ancestral land of many First Nations peoples. We live, work, play, and pray on Treaty 13 lands. May we live in harmony and respect with all those who share the earth with us, and be thankful as we move toward a peaceful and healthy future together. So this evening is the beginning of a three-part series where we will be exploring three different topics. One with a focus on energy and electricity, and our guest speaker this evening is How-Sen, and he's going to, we'll learn a little bit more about him later. And then the second of the series will be on buildings, and the third will be on transportation. And all of these, this whole series is inspired by the book titled Solved by David Miller. And we're going to begin this evening by listening to a talk that David gave, and this will be repetitive maybe for Joyce and maybe some others, I'm not sure, but it's a good repetitive. He does a really lovely job of sort of capturing the essence of his book and some of the positive possibilities of cities doing good things in response to climate change. So let's take a moment now and listen to David Miller.
Okay. I'm going to speak about climate change and what I think is our main hope for solutions to this global challenge, which is cities. I suspect some of what I have to say will be a little bit depressing, although perhaps well known. But I hope that some of what I have to say gives cause for optimism and is perhaps a little less well known. I understand that the passage in Genesis 26 to 28, particularly paragraph 28, has led to a theological debate about whether the earth, animals, and nature are there for man to exploit, or that we should be stewards of the earth. Paragraph 28 says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Without judging the debate or the meaning of Genesis, I'm a lawyer by training and a politician by choice, not a theologian or a minister, but it's fair to say we've done a rotten job. I won't list the litany of environmental challenges the world faces, but suffice to say they're numerous. Philosophically, an overly vigorous use of a broad interpretation of humanity's dominion over nature has basically led to the exploitation of resources to serve human desires, not the needs of the planet or animals or even human needs. Economically, the preferred systems treat the planet and its resources as an afterthought, quite literally. Pollution, to economists, is an externality, and our economic systems that we use to make decisions in society are based on a belief that if we use up resources, we can just invent something else. So that means that the impact of human activities on our planet and on nature is not included in the way we think about the organization of our society, particularly through an economic perspective. One of the many consequences of these powerful, but from my perspective, wrong ideas is the increasing and immediate threat of climate change. Climate change results from human activity, the burning of fossil fuels, and the consequences to humans and our planet are potentially very serious indeed. Just this week, the world's scientists warned us that we need to act immediately if we are to be still hopeful of keeping overall average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less. And that's the level at which we start to lose control of what's happening. And the science predicts really serious consequences. Roughly speaking, that means we have to have the greenhouse gas emissions of the world as a whole by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. And the consequences, if we don't meet these thresholds, are serious indeed. I do wish to highlight a few. Increasing severity and frequency of storms will lead to more flooding and perhaps paradoxically, more drought. Sea level rise will lead to consequences like Wall Street, the heart of the world's financial system, being underwater. And perhaps more importantly, desperately poor people in places like Indonesia and Bangladesh will have literally nowhere left to live. Arctic sea ice will melt, and in fact is melting today, leading to incalculable damage to nature and the way of life of Inuit people who depend on sea ice for their hunting culture. And more, the Gulf Stream could eventually reverse, completely changing the habitability of the United Kingdom and Northern Europe. And no one knows precisely how many species will become extinct, but it's a significant number. Let's just focus on one issue for a moment, drought. It's estimated that hundreds of millions of people will be forced to migrate within and between countries due to the loss of arable land caused by climate change. To put this in a political context, there were 2 or 3 million people fleeing the war in Syria, and it completely destabilized Europe's politics because people didn't know how to accept that many refugees seeking refuge all at once. Parenthetically, it's at least arguable that the political turmoil that led to the conflict in Syria was caused by crop failures, in turn caused by climate-related droughts. It's not proven, but it may well be possible. Bring that locally. We've seen a controversy over the past months and years about a place called Roxham Road in Quebec, and refugees seeking refuge in Canada coming through the border there. About 100 persons a day cross through Roxham Road. Pursuant to Canada's international obligations and treaties that we've signed, imagine the political challenges if 1,000 came, or 10,000 or more, fleeing drought conditions and seeking places where they could obtain food. It's just a snapshot of what the world faces. But the future, if we don't address climate change, is grim. And the news is bad. No country in the world is on track to meet its stated climate goals. And even the commitments that the countries have made are not enough. So national governments are not meeting their promises, and their promises are too weak. There's some glimmers of hope with our neighbor to the south through the Inflation Reduction Act that essentially implements a Green New Deal in the United States. And if the money under that act is not blocked by the Republican parts of Congress, transformational actions will happen in the United States. But it's an exception. In most of the world, national governments are not living up to their commitments. It's all talk and little action. But for me, that's where it's time to look for hope. Because unlike national governments, globally, cities are acting on climate change. And it makes sense, because by their nature, city governments are governments that act. For example, it's been 29 years since national governments and the United Nations agreed that climate change was an urgent crisis that required global action. Yet little of the magnitude required has happened. Could you imagine if a city acted the same way? For example, saying, our water is not fit to drink. Please wait 30 years and we'll fix it. It's not possible for that to happen within a city government because the nature of a city's responsibilities requires action, not just words. The other good news is that cities are actually where the problem is. Some 70% or more of global greenhouse gases occur in cities or are linked to the activities required to support them, like a power plant, even if it's technically outside the boundary of the city. Increasingly, those cities are where the solutions are, because the greenhouse gas emissions within cities mostly occur in 4 areas: transportation, buildings, how we generate our electricity, and waste. And the world's biggest cities are finding low carbon and equitable ways to build cities that reduce carbon emissions in each of these areas and others like food. And the best ideas are spreading. The biggest challenge we face is to ensure that those ideas are implemented in enough places around the world to ensure that we have emissions by 2030, which is what science says we must do. So what are cities doing? Well, first of all, the best have climate plans that address each of these areas and more. And they succeed. In Toronto, for example, as a result of the actions in each of these areas, transportations, buildings, electricity, and waste, set forth in its 2007 climate plan called Changes in the Air and the closing of the Lakeview power plant by the province, Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions today are 33% below what they were in 1990, despite a busy and growing city. And the leading cities, unlike countries, have committed to having these plans. For example, in 2015, as I'm sure you all are aware, in Paris, national governments finally reached agreement on climate action, allowing each country to set its own targets and plans with a target of holding global heating to 2 degrees, which was insufficient, but advocates were happy because at least there was an agreement. A year later, C40 Cities, who, loosely speaking, is an organization of the mayors of the world's largest cities, today 97, originally 40. The joint population is about 700 million people, so like a very large country, joined together at their summit and committed that every single city, as a condition of membership, would have a climate plan, would undertake actions to implement it, and that their plan would be based on what the science said, which is that 1.5 degrees is the most we can allow global heating to reach. Known as Deadline 2020 because cities in the developed world had to peak their emissions by 2020, today 2/3 of C40 cities have publicly adopted such plans and begun implementation. And by the end of the year, it will be 85%. Is it all of them? No. But it's a significant amount and a very significant contrast to the failure of national governments to even honor their insufficient commitments. One of the ideas behind this organization of the world's largest cities is that when a large city makes a breakthrough, it allows others without the same resources or the same political influence to follow. So Deadline 2020's ideas have spread across the world. In Denmark, for example, nearly every city and town has a Deadline 2020 plan through a partnership led by the city of Copenhagen, who is a C40 member. And in Glasgow, at the International Conference of Countries 2 years ago, over 1,000 global cities signed up to the same standards. So what are these cities doing? They're electrifying transportation. They're encouraging zero-emission buildings. They're cleaning the power grid and waste systems, and much more. For example, Shenzhen in China has completely electrified its public bus fleet. And by the way, it runs over 15,000 buses. We're making strides in Toronto, but in a very Canadian way, we have a pilot project. It's on its way to completely electrifying its taxi fleet. And as a result of that, it's home to the world's largest electric bus manufacturer. Vancouver is requiring all new buildings to essentially be net zero by 2030. And New York City is requiring all commercial buildings over a certain size to have emissions by 2030 as well. Oslo, Los Angeles, and others are working to ensure that the way we build buildings uses low emission techniques, and new technologies encouraged by cities like Shark Energy based in Vancouver are proliferating. Shark uses the waste heat in wastewater and sewage to heat and cool buildings. And these kinds of technologies are becoming both practical and economic because cities are becoming a testbed for innovation. In most global cities, buildings are the biggest single source of emissions. In Toronto, it's around 60%, New York around 70%, to give an example. So these strategies and others, like our Better Buildings partnership here, matter significantly. Even if the idea of an energy efficient building doesn't grab the headlines like building a new subway, using electric vehicles, or other initiatives. But it's not just about how we power our transportation or about how we build buildings. It's also about the kinds of cities we design and build. Around the world, like in Buenos Aires, Barcelona, and Paris, cities are trying to ensure that they grow within their existing boundaries and do not sprawl, using the idea of a 15-minute city, a city where a person's daily needs can be met within a short distance of their house and apartment, so they can walk, cycle, or take transit and don't need to drive. And by daily needs, I mean needs for recreation, for work, for nutrition, for services like healthcare, their church, and much, much more. A really important initiative, contrasted with what we're doing in Ontario today by freeing up the Greenbelt for sprawl-based development rather than trying to ensure that Toronto grows in a way with these international best practices of a 15-minute city. Cities are contributing to decarbonizing the electricity grid. We're well ahead in Ontario and Quebec, but that's not true globally. For example, under the leadership of former Mayor Eric Garcetti, Los Angeles has gone in a few short years from an electricity system heavily reliant on coal to one that will be entirely clean by 2031, certified by outside reports. And cities like Accra in Ghana are taking great strides in reducing methane from informal landfills in informal settlements, including by creating work for those who need it the most. And at its heart, this is why city-based climate action is working, because mayors are using these strategies and more, not just to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to build better, more livable cities where no one is left behind. So what do we need? Well, what we need is for these ideas and actions to not just take place in a few cities, but to occur everywhere. And I'm optimistic that it can and it will. London and Toronto show why. In London, England, an ultra-low emission zone is about to be implemented to cover the entire city. Essentially, you pay a high toll to drive in London if you have a polluting vehicle, and it's free if you don't. And its mayor, Sadiq Khan, is fighting this issue not just for climate reasons, but because London's highly polluted air is causing serious health impacts, particularly amongst children living in low-income neighborhoods. In fact, there's an organization of mothers in London, England, fighting air pollution because children have died from asthma caused by London's air. It's that bad. So Sadiq Khan's climate measure is actually also a health measure. And because the biggest challenges are in low-income neighborhoods located close to polluting roads, it's also an equity measure. And to me, that speaks to the power of city-based climate action. Or we can look closer at home in Toronto. When we were doing public consultations with our transit plan when I was in office, which was called Transit City, part of which is the Eglinton LRT, part of which is the Finch LRT, which are coming along. There was to be another called the Shepherd LRT. There's a long story about that. But when we were speaking to people about it just before we began construction, I went out and took the bus on Shepherd East one weekday morning at 5:45. And I first took the Malvern bus down to Shepherd, and I had a glossy brochure about light rail transit in Transit City. And I was speaking to people on the bus, and I handed it to a woman. She said, "Mayor Miller, what are you doing on my bus at breakfast time?" And I said, "I've come to talk to you about the Shepherd East LRT." "What's an LRT?" An LRT is a European-style tram that runs in the middle of the road in its own right-of-way. It's like an above-ground subway. It'll get you where you're going much faster. And because it's not mixed up with the cars, it'll be on time. And she said, "Boy, that'll help me." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to work." "Where do you work?" "Pearson Airport." She got on the bus in Melbourne, by the way, the first bus I took. "How do you get to Pearson?" "Well, I take the Melbourne bus, the Shepherd bus, to the subway, to the subway, to the bus, to the bus." "You've got a long day." "Oh, Mayor, that's just my morning job. In the afternoon, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel, which is bus, bus, subway, and then subway, subway, bus, bus. She spent hours each day on the bus just putting food on the table, which meant she couldn't get home in time for dinner, which also meant she couldn't do what my mother did. My mother went back to school and graduated from university at the age of 56, going to school at nights. She can't improve her qualifications so she can get one full-time job instead of two part-time jobs because she's not home in time to possibly go to school. And most of all, she can't participate in the democratic debate in her community about the kind of transit people want. And as you know, there was a vigorous debate about whether to build this LRT or not. She couldn't exercise her democratic rights and be part of the life of this city because she was stuck on the bus. Now, Toronto's Transit City plan was part of our climate plan, and it was designed to reach the neighborhoods where people used the bus the most, the places where the lowest income Torontonians live. So just like London, Toronto's climate plans not only address climate change, but they build a more livable city and a place where no one is left behind. We're in a climate crisis, but practical, real solutions exist today that don't require new inventions. Simply the courage to take the best ideas from a city somewhere and do them everywhere quickly. And in doing so, we can build a world where no one is left behind. I think we can, and I know we must. Thank you.
So I guess I'll take over now. Thank you, Leanne, for starting us off, and thank you for playing that video. For those of you who haven't seen it before, I hope it gives you an idea of what David Miller was talking about or discusses in his book, Solved. There it is. If you haven't read it, it's a good one to read. You don't have to read the whole thing. There are chapters on specific topics. But tonight's topic, as Leanne mentioned earlier, is energy and electricity. So we've gotten the overview from David Miller, and now we're going to start digging a little bit deeper and a little more specifically, and tonight is on energy and electricity. And we have our guest, as Leanne mentioned, is How-Sen Chong from the Toronto Environmental Alliance. And I'm just going to read just give him a very brief introduction. How-Sen has been working in the climate and climate justice movements for over 20 years. He has dedicated his work to pressuring governments and corporations to stop using fossil fuels. He was a digital campaigner at Stand Earth, where he worked under Indigenous leadership alongside environmentalists and citizens to oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline on Coast Salish territory. He's worked with many other organizations, environmental organizations and groups, including the United Nations Development Fund, Greenpeace, Environmental Defense, and Indigenous Climate Action. He is currently the climate campaigner with Toronto Environmental Alliance. Now, some of you might remember Emily Alfred from T, who was our speaker back in January when we looked at waste issues in Toronto. Anyway, so How-Sen was born and raised in Etobicoke. He holds environmental studies degrees from McGill and Yale and is certified in greenhouse gas accounting. He lives in downtown Toronto. So that's just a little tiny intro to him. And I thank you very much, How-Sen, for agreeing to come tonight and speak to us about energy and electricity generation and otherwise in Toronto, and what the city is doing now and what is happening in the future that you can maybe inform us about. So over to you.
Great, yeah. I didn't prepare anything at this point for this presentation. I thought I'd kind of like leave things open. But generally speaking, the city of Toronto has, back in 2019, passed what's known as Transform TO, which is a net zero by 2040 plan. The original plan actually was to be net zero by 2050. And then in 2021, City Council unanimously decided to up the game and actually hit net zero by 2040. And so that's a relatively short time ago, 2021, especially if we consider what was going on with the pandemic. And so what we've been seeing in the city over the past several months is starting to put those 2040 net zero plans into its processes. It is slow by some comparisons, but actually quite fast when you look at like where we're at. So even just this week, the city council is expected to pass a carbon budgeting process and a carbon accountability process, which would link a lot of the decision making, financial decision making down the road with the Transform TO plan, which is like legitimately a very, very good plan. The city is not perfect in terms of its systems, and like, you know, we made some comments at city council on like some of the issues that we had with the plan and everything, but the city's philosophy, and this is the correct philosophy, is to move forward with imperfect information and then iterate as time goes on. Since this is a 17-year process between now and 2040, every year the reporting should get better. More things will be added into that processing and all that type of stuff, assuming, of course, that we maintain a city council and with the upcoming mayoral by-election, a mayor who is dedicated to ensuring that this process continues to move forward, is properly resourced in all aspects of Transform TO. And Transform TO hits everything that the former Mayor Miller spoke about: transportation and energy and housing, and also green spaces and some levels of, like, you know, in terms of corporate emissions, greening fleets that the city runs, and waste and all that type of stuff. Yeah, so I don't know if you wanted to go over some of these questions now, or if folks had any questions that they wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea to give. I think people are curious about energy generation in Toronto, and I know that it is it's basically the decisions about generation are not with Toronto Hydro, they're with Ontario Hydro, and that's just transmitted through, or you know, sent to us into our individual buildings and with Toronto Hydro. But just generally, how is generation planned for the future? We have been just hearing lately about how there seems to be some feeling that natural gas generation is going to increase for electricity. Just over the last couple of weeks, that's been in the news. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit of an overview about energy and electricity generation.
Yeah, and that is absolutely true. The province is planning on adding more gas to the system. What the province has been saying is that gas to the system will primarily be used for peak generation. And so one of the interesting aspects of electricity generation is that you have a baseline generation, and then at peaks, which tends to be breakfast time and dinner time, there tend to be electrical peaks at that point in time as people turn on their appliances, open their fridge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that tends to be where the peaks are, is during the morning and the afternoon. And those peaks get higher in the summertime when we start turning on our air conditioning. That's how the electricity works. But if we're talking about overall home energy use, we also have to take into account that there is a significant amount of natural gas, what people call natural gas, what's been traditionally called natural gas, used in the wintertime as well. And so as time goes on, likelihood as we start moving our way off of gas, we'll start seeing more spikes in the electricity grid. The electricity grid right now is about 34% nuclear, 27% gas, 24% hydro, with the remaining a combination of wind, solar, and biofuels. And so this is from I can actually share my screen. Oh, I can't share my screen. But
are you able to? Maybe I have to make you part host. Is it?
Says now I'm a co-host. So I'll just show you very briefly. This is just off of the website. That's generally what we're talking about here. This orange slice is nuclear, gas is this dark blue, hydro is this light blue, and the remainder is renewables. And so it's about a third hydro, wind, solar, biofuels, 27% gas, and 34% nuclear. So that's how our electricity is currently generated within the province of Ontario. If you compare this to 2010 or 2007, 15 years ago, a significant amount of this would have been coal. But a previous provincial government started eliminating coal back around between the years of 2008 through 2011. And it's significantly reduced our greenhouse gas emissions as a result. So if you actually look at what the city is at, I'll show you. Let me show you a presentation that I recently did. Right here. I'll share my screen again. Right here. This is the city's total community greenhouse gas emissions. And if you take a look, there's this yellow line from here starting. You can see that this yellow line is the 2020 target that net zero set, which is a 30% decrease from 1990 levels. We hit that target back in 2011 because of the elimination of coal from our electrical system. Since then, we've been having some trouble reducing emissions. You can see the biggest drop in terms of emissions reductions was 2020 when COVID hit. On the right there, those yellow bars are the 2025, that's 2030, and the 2040 net zero targets as well. So it's possible that we're now kind of flatlining a little bit post-COVID, and we have a pretty good chance of hitting our 2025 goals if the emissions don't start shooting back up significantly. So that's an important context to understand how important our electrical grid is. And so the province's attempt to introduce more gas into the system will increase our greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. And that's a problem. That's a significant problem. On the other hand, the other thing to consider as well is that 54% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions comes from burning gas for heat, for heating our air, for heating water. So 54%, that's more than half of the total emissions from the city of Toronto is from heating gas in our own homes right now. It has nothing to do with the electrical system. So one of the challenges with gas is that one of the challenges with heat is that if you try to use a resistor, which is the traditional way we've been producing heat from electricity, to produce heat, it will actually be very, very expensive and very, very costly and very energy inefficient. That's the trouble with that. What we're now seeing in the market is basically a reversible air conditioner. These things are called heat pumps. And what they do is they actually move heat rather than produce heat. And they are incredibly energy efficient. Your electrical systems would have to be basically 100% coal for you to produce as much greenhouse gas emissions from using a heat pump as you would when you're taking away from natural gas. And so if you switch from natural gas heating to an electric-based heat pump, unless your electrical system is almost 100% coal, you will actually be overall reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's how efficient these heat pumps actually are. One of the other benefits of these heat pumps is you don't necessarily need to, I mean, it would still benefit your costs, but you can cut your emissions from heating and cooling your home to almost zero direct emissions. They'll all come from the electrical system at this point, but you can cut your direct emissions to almost zero without the necessity of spending the extra money updating your windows and your insulation, things like that. So there's a lot of people who are saying one of the climate solutions is to actually do a mass electrification of homes in places where gas is a significant source of heating water and heating air, which is exactly where we're at in Toronto. I see a hand up.
Oh, hold on a second. I don't seem to have, I
Peter.
need to put you on here so I can see everybody.
Peter.
Peter. Yeah, go ahead.
So are there any incentives from Toronto, or not likely the Ontario government, to try and move more houses to heat pumps and away from gas, which is the primary heating system now?
The city has a program for households, which are basically like smaller households with like fewer than 7 units in them, called HELP, which is the it's the electrical loan program.
Yeah.
I forgot what the H stood for.
Householder or homeowners or something. Yeah.
Home energy loan.
That's it. Home energy loan program. Yeah.
And what it is a lower, the city is using its own excellent credit to loan out to residences to actually be able to borrow off of the city, and then you pay back through your taxes. And so if you end up selling your house, the cost of that stays with the house rather than goes with you to your new house. And so that's one of the benefits, one of the programs that exists. People can, of course, obviously go back and like do their own loans. The federal government right now doesn't have any incentives for heat pumps unless your house is currently running off of oil. And so when you look at stats now in Atlantic Canada, something like 30% of households in Atlantic Canada now have heat pumps, because a lot of Atlantic Canada is actually heated by oil. And so the uptake has been massive. So that gives you an idea as to how effective some of these incentives are. Yeah. So we do need something like that, like similar to what the government is doing for EVs right now, but for heat pumps, it would have a significant impact on reducing emissions.
And are there any similar options for condos at all?
Yeah, so there's something called high-rise, which is for multi-unit residential buildings. The challenge with doing multi-unit residential buildings for condos and things like that, and these are the condos that you see in Toronto. I totally understand that there are condos which are which look like single-family homes over a larger area of land, but in Toronto they're almost all going to be high towers. The challenge with that is that under the current condo regulations, it's not easy to actually get approval to do that because you need a very high percentage of homeowners within the condo to approve.
Yeah.
And so that's something that we're looking into, and we will be looking into like potentially campaigning on over the next year or two. And that's definitely something on our radar because it is a very significant impact. But also once you do a building like Toronto TRHC that does all the housing, they're doing their buildings, and the results that they're seeing are quite spectacular.
Okay.
Joyce, you had a question?
What more of a comment? I mean, you know, what How-Sen has said with respect to condos is absolutely right. However, about, I don't remember exactly, but certainly over 15 years ago, what the provincial government did was for building older buildings, such as the one where I live, where when I first moved in here, I paid for my electricity through my common elements. So my electricity was based on my square footage as opposed to my usage. And that was in the condo declaration. So we needed a 90% ownership vote in favor of changing it. But the provincial government overrode it and said the board of directors can just go ahead, doesn't matter what's in the declaration, and individually meter all of the units if they so wish, so that unit owners pay by usage as opposed to square footage. So in fact, that's what my board of directors did, because we were fortunately wired already so that, you know, somebody just had to come in and essentially stick meters in for all of our units in a building. So I think that what we would need to do is something similar, you know, get a provincial regulation changed to allow boards of directors to implement these changes, regardless of what's in the condo declaration, so that the buildings can become energy efficient. You know, in situations where, you know, they are using fossil fuels to heat. Now, I'm in a building that was built in the 70s when electricity was cheap, so I have electricity already. And then there are a lot of buildings that are already using individual heat pumps, particularly the newer buildings.
Yeah, so 2 points there. One, heat pumps are interesting because they are also air conditioners in the summertime. They are reversible, and so as a climate solution, it helps when the weather gets too hot. But also you have something that even if you do have gas-fired heating in your building, you can still turn on the electricity with the heat pump and take most of your energy take most of your heating from the heat pump rather than from the production of electricity. Sorry, the production of heat by burning of fossil fuels. Again, I can't stress, it's just, this is how the physics works. Creating heat is extremely energy intensive. It is like the least efficient type of energy. At the end of every energy process, there's heat. It is extremely inefficient to create heat. So the magic of heat pumps is it just moves heat around rather than creating it. And so that's why it can be very, very highly efficient. And so that's, for example, like we already have like existing conventional conduction stove. And then there's also induction stove. So the conduction stove is like what we grew up with. There's a little thing that gets hot and it heats up the pan, it heats up the pot, and everything works. An induction stove, what it actually does is it uses magnets to heat up the pot itself. So it will only work for pots that are like made out of steel or magnetic. So copper pots don't really work, but it is complete magic. It boils water very, very fast. And is extremely energy efficient. It's like 90% energy efficient as opposed to like 30 or 40. And so these are the types of solutions that can occur, but also like Joyce just alluded also to one of the challenges with some of these solutions is, and this is one of the challenges with buildings in general, it's relatively easy to replace the entire vehicle fleet because every 10, 15 years, everybody kind of gets a new car anyways, but that's not how it works with buildings. There are buildings in the city of Toronto that probably do not have an electrical system good enough or even updated enough to actually put an air conditioner system, let alone a heat pump in every unit. Some of the older 100-year-old buildings, for example, they would have to be significantly changed. So this is one of the reasons why these types of conversations are important, is because we do need folks to understand how this works and then organize at that super local building level to start making these changes. Because like Peter's building, for example, assuming Peter, you're asking because you live in a condo, I'm not quite sure. Peter's,
yeah.
Is that true?
Townhouse condos, yeah.
Yeah, so Peter's building is almost guaranteed not going to work the same as Joyce's building is. And so it's important for folks to understand kind of like the basics of this and then push for the changes that works for them. There's no magic bullet. And again, this is one of the structurally interesting things about climate change itself. And one of the reasons why what former Mayor Miller was saying, well, cities are doing all this work that national governments are having a difficult time doing, because ultimately climate change is a thing, but what actually solves climate change are the individual actions, building by building, person by person. And it is an incredibly difficult problem to solve, but it is solvable. It requires everybody to understand what's going on and understand the circumstances and change those circumstances directly themselves as well. So it's multiple things. So while we're trying to change policies kind of like at these like municipal level and provincial and federal level to make it easier for folks, there still is stuff that needs to be done at the super local level, at the individual level, at the household level, the building level, to get the changes done and to move things.
And given the high percentage of urban population in Canada as the percentage of the total, cities can make a big difference.
80%, that's right.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a comment and then kind of get you going in a different direction or a further direction. First of all, we actually installed a heat pump in our house just within the last month. And there is, in fact, both provincial and federal incentives. It's $6,500. The total cost of a heat pump is around $15,000. So it's not quite half. So it could be a lot better because, a lot of people, that's still a lot of money. So anyway, but that's where the municipal, the help loan program can maybe kick in as well. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that there is something there. But I guess I wanted to talk a little bit more about energy generation. So, there's the individual home and building heating systems and cooling systems. And yeah, absolutely. In terms of renewables in the city, are there, I think you said it was about a third right now in Ontario generally. Is it, how I know we've all heard about, solar roofs and a lot of downtown and commercial and industrial buildings. Is that becoming a growing thing? And is wind at all used, other than the great big wind turbine, is wind used at all to generate electricity more locally in Toronto as opposed to outside in the rural areas?
Wind is not generally generated in large amounts within the city of Toronto. It is possible to put a small wind turbine on your house. It is absolutely possible, but then it also requires you to do a significant rewiring of your house. It's the same thing for electrical generation. The key challenge for most buildings is that we have what's known as alternating current. All energy is produced with direct current and then transferred into alternating current. And direct current, to give you an example, is a battery directly into into your, I don't know, like your phone or something like that. That's a direct current. Everything requires direct current, like everything that's powered requires direct current to run. But most of our our energy transportation systems are alternating current, because alternating current, you can transfer the electricity larger distances with relatively small loss. And so what ends up happening is you have something typically turning a turbine, and in some cases a photovoltaic cell, producing electricity at one end in direct current, and it's transferred into alternating current for the long distances. And then it's transferred again when it comes into your wall as alternating current, and then everything that we plug into the wall has what's known as AC adapter. So you've probably heard of an AC adapter. And what an AC adapter is transfers that alternating current to direct current. And so everything coming out of your wall right now is alternating current. If you were to build put up a solar panel, or put up like a windmill on your house or on your property, it's producing direct current, and you would need to transfer that to alternating current in order to come into your house, and then change that. So there's a significant loss every time you do that. And there's a significant cost in order to do that as well. So right now, a lot of people, like, there are people putting up solar on their homes, but again, it's very, very specific as to like where you're at. If, like, for me, I have a very small house with a very small footprint, and my roof is facing the wrong way, and there's a tall building just south of me. So it doesn't make sense for me to put up solar on my house. If you have a larger property, like my parents live in Etobicoke, they have a larger lot, that might make more economic sense for them to put up a solar panel. And so yeah, solar is kind of popping up here and there, but we don't have the same kinds of incentives as we had, 15 years ago. But solar has become incredibly cheap for folks to build. On the other hand, it's still going to cost, tens of thousands of dollars to install something. So it's.
I was really wondering more about, how much solar generation there is in commercial and industrial sector, in some of the bigger buildings and even schools and things like that. I mean, I know at one point there was a lot of talk about, I'm a retired teacher with a TASB, and I know at one point there was a lot of talk about solar panels on, all sorts of school roofs if it was appropriate, and there was a big directional push, and some schools were saying, yep, you're going to be on the list, and I guess I just wanted to find out if like in that sector, commercial, industrial, governmental, whatever sector, is there, instead of individual houses, are there more, is there more larger scale generation that's maybe going into the grid as opposed to going to power that particular building? I just wanted to know, but if you could give us any information on that.
Yeah, so I was around when that solar renaissance happened in Ontario as well. We're talking about 15 years ago. And it was happening quite quickly. And then when this provincial government came into power, they started canceling solar contracts. And so with the cancellation of solar contracts, my read of it, and this is, I've only been back to Toronto since 2019, but my read of it is that the push for solar has stalled significantly as a result of the cancellation of those contracts. It's had a chilling effect on the solar industry in Southern Ontario, which is a significant problem. And so, yeah, it's an issue. Like the wind, you can theoretically put up a wind, but there aren't really fantastic opportunities for that. You'll probably get angry letters from your neighbors in a way that you won't with a solar panel, for example. So if you do have a larger house with a larger footprint, chances of you getting pretty good sunlight coming in is relatively high, and solar is a potential option for you. But if
similarly, about a decade ago, there was a big investigation, I thought by the city, but maybe the city and province, for more wind turbines off the shore on Lake Ontario, where you get more steady winds. Has anything happened to move towards that as a source of electricity for the city?
I'm not up to date on that particular project.
Okay.
I know there has been talk around that, but there also has been, as a result of that, a very large kind of anti-windmill group that's kind of come out of the woodwork. My gut feeling is that there will probably be another push for it over the next 3 to 5 years for more wind. I think
as we get towards 2040.
As we get towards 2040, yeah. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is that the city of Toronto is about to sign an agreement with Toronto Hydro so that Toronto Hydro meets up with the city's net zero goals. Toronto Hydro has the ability in some cases to produce electricity under, I think it's 7 megawatts or something like that. So for these kind of like smaller electrical generation processes. And also what's likely going to happen is, I mean, one of the dreams that people have been talking about for a while is the use of batteries and battery power, because batteries, what they can do is in off-peak hours, take the electricity, hold it, and then smooth out that demand curve during the day when it's higher in demand. And so batteries can come in all shapes and sizes. One potential option for us to do that is, like, you know, people are talking about like using like small dams and things like that. We have 3 or 4 major reservoirs in the city. All you need to do to produce electricity is either, if you don't have a photovoltaic cell, is to turn a turbine.
Yep.
And produce electricity. It's relatively simple, but it's about doing it at a large enough scale. And so that's kind of where we're at in terms of electricity. We've been trying to, my work more recently at City Hall has been focused. I haven't really been doing that much work on local electricity yet, because most of my experience has been provincial, and so but looking at like the demand side of energy and of emissions. And I know you'll be going into buildings later, but it really is because the emissions, because of 54% of emissions in the city are from gas, and because of how difficult a problem it is to solve, given how different all the buildings are across the city, that it is something that we are at T focusing on a little bit more at this point in time, because the electrical system can be changed relatively quickly by adding more supply of renewables. But like, we do need to end this addition of gas onto the system. It's a very significant problem that we have.
I find it really interesting that Toronto Hydro can, in fact, in their mandate, produce some electricity or generate, make plans for some generation, a small scale at least. I didn't realize that. So is that something that is new, or it's always been written into their agreement with the province, and it's just they haven't really done much with it, or is this something new?
Yeah, it's been there for a while. My understanding, and this may be incorrect, but my understanding of it is specifically allow for households to produce electricity for the grid, and for smaller organizations to produce the grid. So it's not Toronto Hydro, but
I get it.
Legally for Toronto Hydro to for us, if you own a house, to actually sell it onto the grid. So it is possible, but kind of between you and me, I've been hearing a lot of, and this is one of the reasons why the city has placed this agreement, this MOU with Toronto Hydro, is that Toronto Hydro quite recently hasn't really been stepping up to the plate as much as it should be, given the enormity of this challenge. But hopefully we will be seeing a change over the next little while as Toronto Hydro picks up, and all that does, and it just requires everybody in the city, or as many people in the city as possible, to speak out and to just keep talking, all councillors, and to call their MPPs and their MPs and do that political push as well, regardless as to who the politician is, what color their political party is. It doesn't matter ultimately. This is a very deep challenge, but on the plus side, it's something that almost everybody agrees with. Transform TO and the calling of the climate emergency was passed unanimously by City Hall and by all the politicians in City Hall. So it was John Tory and like all the people on the right and all the people on the left and all the centrists, all of them pushed for it. And the reason why they did was, if you remember in 2019, there was a massive push. It was this like the biggest climate demonstration I've ever seen in the city that September in 2019. So they were able to.
Our speaker next week is from the City of Toronto's Transform TO Buildings Group. So we have some questions for them.
Yeah, and I think that's great. It is really important to understand how important buildings are. And former Mayor Miller mentioned that as well. Like buildings are 60% of the emissions of the city. And because of the nature of those emissions, it's 54% of all of the emissions of the city come from gas. And so we need an electrical system that can handle the switch over from gas to electric heating. And one of the ways we do that is to, rather than produce heat through electricity, we produce heat by using electricity to move heat from the outside of the house inside the house, and vice versa. Use electricity to heat water on demand rather than keeping a tank of water hot 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nonstop, and using fossil fuels to heat that water. And understanding how the politics work, and understanding that, like, yeah, it's Enbridge says a lot of great things about climate, but it is against their financial interest to use gas. And that's the reality. As good-hearted as the people who will work at Enbridge actually are, that overarching problem is a significant barrier to where it is that we need to go. And so, yeah, it's an issue. It's a serious issue.
Stephen.
Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Sorry, I was late in joining. The Ford government is saying that they want to build, 1 or 2 million houses or something, or at least units across the province in a fast track kind of way. Is it baked into the regulations for all those new buildings that they should have heat pumps?
Not yet. In Toronto, if you were to build it in Toronto, Toronto has what's called the Toronto Green Standard. So it depends on the municipality. In Toronto, the Toronto Green Standard has different tiers, and the highest tier that exists right now has the effect of making it almost impossible to build a building that's fired by natural gas, and that's heated by natural gas. And so that's one of the reasons why we had campaigned against Bill 23 when it was passed last February, was that we were very concerned about its impact on the legal on all the legal processes that ensure that the Toronto Green Standard for new buildings is built. But again, it depends on the municipality. Different municipalities are in different spaces when it comes to that. But yeah, it is. It's a significant challenge for new buildings, and that's one of the reasons why I have this job is to try to find ways of campaigning and ensuring that we don't continue to burn fossil fuels.
Yeah. How-Sen, could you just, for people who aren't familiar, just do a brief summary of what Bill 23 is?
Yeah, so Bill 23 was Premier Ford's bill to try to increase the amount of housing built. It was, I forgot, the more built faster.
Oh, it's the more better housing, yeah.
Yeah, something along those lines. And so the idea in general was we're going to cut red tape so that houses can be built faster. And one of the things that they were cutting was a municipality's ability to approve or disapprove buildings based off of what the building looked like. And that is the legal instrument upon which the Toronto Green Standard and a bunch of similar green standards and a few other municipalities across Ontario were basing their new building climate and environmental standards upon. And so our allies, and we talked to our allies, we've talked to the province says that was not something that they considered, that they had considered they meant to do. And so so we think that the municipalities are pretty good in moving forward, and so the Toronto Green Standard for the time being has been maintained. There is an additional issue, of course, with like things like sprawl and stuff like that, and how that has an effect on anything from food security, green space, which is absolutely vital as the climate gets hotter and it gets wetter in this part of the world. And of course, the things like travel time and the additional emissions and the additional even financial costs of maintaining sprawl, which tends to be very costly, not just in terms of emissions, but in terms of finances on a per unit basis. Most municipalities, I remember in the 90s when like governments in Mississauga was like, we have extremely low taxes, this is great. And then 15 years later, they couldn't see that anymore. And the reason why that is of course your taxes are great if you were like built all your infrastructure in the 1980s, and then it doesn't start falling apart until the 2010s. And then suddenly in the 2010s, they can't say that anymore. And it becomes really expensive to maintain unless you do density, because sprawl just can't handle, just doesn't have the tax base. One of the ironic things, of course, is that if you are a lower income person living in a high density building, you are subsidizing you actually are subsidizing single family homes in Southern Ontario, because what matters isn't the amount of taxes, it's the amount of tax return per square meter or per square kilometer. And there's just way more people paying taxes in high density, low income areas than there are in places like Rosedale or places like, Brampton or Mississauga or like Markham. So it's just a math problem. That's an issue, and it's one of the reasons why more and more municipalities are realizing that they do have to densify, at least in some corridors, because it's just impossible to maintain the tax base to if you continue on with just low density. It's just not possible financially.
Hey, thanks. I have one more question before unless somebody else has a question that they are burning with right now. I was just wondering, we heard so much about N-Wave for people who read the book and people who've just been around in Toronto for a while, which was using water from Lake Ontario to heat and cool downtown buildings. And I guess I'm just wondering whether, there seemed to be an allusion in the book that maybe this was going to be expanded. And I just wondered if you had heard anything about that, whether there was some information about it expanding, and whether in fact that might have some kind of an adverse effect on lake temperature and wildlife in the lakes and that sort of thing. Can you give us any information about that?
Yeah, so N-Wave is actually quite brilliant. It works in Toronto partly because of how the lake works right off of the city of Toronto. There's a significant drop of the water shelf, of like the actual like ground shelf right off the city of Toronto. So it allows for the city to, so that water will maintain a relatively regular temperature throughout both the summer and the winter. And so in the winter time, they take that lake water, which is probably going to be about 2, 3, 4 degrees. And then they use that to heat as heating and that's produced and that's distributed throughout primarily downtown core. N-Wave is constantly expanding. So as like more buildings are built, more and more of these buildings are using the N-Wave system, and it's basically like they're just buying heat and they're buying cooling from N-Wave. And so they just pump that energy back and forth. And so similarly with in our summertime when the lake is relatively cool, they take that water and they use that gather the heat from those buildings, and then they use the lake water to cool that building. This is called district energy, and this is like lake water district energy, which is very significant, which has a very significant impact on the city and its energy use downtown for heating. Again, like once again, the reason why this works is because it's very expensive to produce heat. So rather than producing heat, you are moving heat utilizing the temperature differentials of the lake in this case. So similarly, geothermal system does the same thing with the ground, and air source heat pumps does the same thing with the air. It just so happens that with the lake, we have something like that. So it is expanding. There's also this building where it used to be the Globe and Mail building at Spadina and Front, called the Well. And it's called the Well because there's a giant well holding water down there in order to do that energy exchange. It's really great.
Now, originally, I thought that was mostly government and big commercial buildings in downtown. Are any of these waterfront condos able to take advantage of N-Wave?
I don't know the answer to that. My understanding is that it is primarily commercial and institutional buildings. So I don't know, to be honest, if there are residential buildings, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are, to be honest, because it's not. Yes. It makes a lot of sense, actually. It's just the question of whether or not that will have an impact on the lake environment is actually, this was actually a significant issue that environmentalists, when they were first proposing this, raised. And what the solution was actually quite brilliant, which is the water that they're taking out. So the idea is like you take water, it's like, say it's the summertime, you take cold water from the lake, and then you're cooling everything. Now you suddenly have all this warm water. You dump it back on the lake, you can potentially have an impact at where that water is being dumped. But rather than dumping to the lake, they put it through the municipal water system. And so that heat, rather than going directly one source, is now spread out across the entire system like everything else. And now the city is actually starting to do a sewage exchanging. So where what they will be doing is taking the excess heat from the sewage system and then selling that heat to Toronto Western Hospital, which will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by something like 90%, or a very, very significant amount. And so, yeah, so this is the thing to understand. It's like in this part of the world, it's less about electricity and actually more about heat. It's more about like, how do we do heating and cooling? Because there is about a 70–80% temperature differential between one season to the other. And that has a significant impact on how we manage comfort in our lives and stuff like that. So it is important for us to recognize that and understand that like there are very unique ways that Toronto is dealing with heat, have very little to do with producing heat using electricity and more about using electricity and other means to move heat around from point A to point B.
Thanks. Maggie, I saw that you had a hand up and then it's now down, but did you have a question?
No, that was a thumbs up. Sorry.
Oh, it was a thumbs up. Okay, sorry. It looked like it.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Does anybody else have a question for How-Sen or a comment? Stephen.
Yeah, sorry, I don't understand the heat transfer concept when you said in the winter they take water out of the lake that's like 2 or 3 degrees. That doesn't sound very hot to me. So could you just explain how that ends up heating buildings, which would otherwise be very cold?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I still have a difficult time. First of all, you can actually use. Let me just do the simplest way is if it's -20 degrees outside or -15 degrees, and if the source that you have is 2 degrees, that is a 10–15 degree difference. And if you think about how much energy that actually is to heat 15 degrees for all of the square footage, it is an enormous amount of energy. And so rather than utilizing fossil fuels or or other sources to do that, you use lake water. And even that, if that's the simplest way of doing it, you decrease the heat requirement by 15 degrees. So you still might be using natural gas to like increase the temperature to 20 degrees, but you're not using nearly as much natural gas as you otherwise would. And that is a significant cost difference that can occur. On the other hand, though, like it actually gets more complex than that, because when you use heat exchangers, they use systems of pressurization to actually capture and take away heat. It's how your fridge works. And so one of the interesting things about fluids like air and water is that when something gets colder, it decreases in volume. And when something gets hotter, it increases in volume. But the opposite is true. When something in a vacuum increases in volume, it gets hotter. And then when something in a vacuum decreases in volume, it gets colder. And so you can actually use that to actually, when you have that vacuum, to literally pull heat from one point to the other. So that's why when you look at the back of your fridge, when you feel the back of your fridge, it's always warm, because it has a series of nozzles in a vacuum that are constantly moving a fluid back and forth and changing the pressure from high density to low density. And that process naturally pulls heat from your fridge into the coils and out the back of your refrigerator. And so that's similarly how a heat pump works, but in reverse in your house. And the reason why that works is, it might be negative 20 degrees outside, but it's not negative 40 degrees. So it might feel difficult to me, but it can still drop 200 degrees, 230 degrees until you hit absolute zero, which we don't want to do because that's when everything starts becoming nothing. So yeah, there's always heat in the system. Even if it feels cold to us, there's going to be heat until you get to the point where like matter stops acting like actual matter, which happens nowhere on Earth except for, I think, in a couple of places where they're starting to work on like different kinds of quantum computers and stuff like that inside a lab. So.
We seem to have somebody, a man named David McLeod from City of Toronto with us. I'm not sure whether you're in an official capacity with City of Toronto in this sort of area and you have a question, or whether you're just,
Well, I will introduce myself. Peter Wilkins and I know each other from Eglinton St. George. And years ago, I actually gave a talk on climate adaptation, which is my specialty area.
Oh, right,
and so How-Sen and I have met before. And he knows that I work full time for the City of Toronto in the Environment and Climate Division.
And David helped to get a speaker for next week as well.
Yeah.
Right. Now I recognize your name. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really glad that that this group has come together. And I hope that you're learning a lot. Sorry I had to join a bit late. My daughter's going to Uganda tomorrow, and I've been helping her out. So, but I do have a question. Hopefully you can see. I have a radiator there. Okay, and so I live in a house that's nearly 100 years old, and we've done the energy audit and we improved our energy efficiency by more than 25% by doing some various renovations, but we still have a natural gas boiler. And I mean, as I understand it, there's not that many homes in Toronto that have ever tried to get a heat pump if they've got what's called hydronic or radiators. Okay.
Oh, right. Nope.
All right. I mean, it's far, far simpler if you've just got vents and a furnace, like so much easier. So How-Sen, is that an area you're knowledgeable on that you can give any comment?
I mean, like a heat pump depends on how big your house. If you have a like my house is an old workers' cottage. There's generally like one room and the basement, and so we're heated primarily by hot water, similarly as yours. But in the summertime, we cool down by the one air conditioning unit on the wall. So for us, it'd be relatively easy for us to switch that into a heat pump.
Okay. No, not so good with me. It's not that it's a huge house, but 3,000 square feet. No, 2,000. And see that? I don't know if you can see it. Right there.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a duct that we call for space pack. it's plugged off right now, but we have a separate system for that. Anyways, I've talked to a lot of people, and I've even tried to get quotes, and the companies are just saying, talk to us in 7 years. Really?
Yeah, it is. We talked about this before. It is very building specific, because some of the newer buildings with central ducting, it can be a lot easier to just put in like a bigger heat pump in. But older buildings might have difficulty. Some older buildings might not even have an electrical system that can handle it. Like you may have to.
We'd have to
redo the
update.
entire electrical
Absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, we've been able to limp along with just a regular outlet to charge our electric car. We don't drive that much, so it's worked out okay. But that's another issue that people don't necessarily think about. I've got a worst case scenario where the power comes at the front of the house and the car is parked way at the back and in a garage that's separate from the house. And I'm looking at easily, I mean, depending on how nice a job I do, $6,000 to put in an outlet that's high powered at the back. It's like, so I just limp along with a regular outlet now.
We
So I
have
have
an
an
electric
EV
charger in our carport, and because we have an electric car too. Yeah, it's great. We feel pretty good. We're off natural gas completely and off gas completely in our car, so that we feel very good about that. But yeah, I mean, it was not nearly that much to install the level 2 charger as you're quoting. So yeah, that's a huge thing. That $66,000. That's like more than four times how much it cost us to
how
put
long
the
is
level
the
2 in.
oven cable to run?
All right.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
It's how long is the oven cable to run to your car? We
Yeah.
had to do that at the cottage
Or
for
is
our
like,
TV.
it depends on your driving scenario. So I have a car. I don't even have a driveway. So we do street parking, but 2 streets down, there is a public EV charger. And so we charge there once every week or two, because the car has a range of 400 kilometers average throughout the year. And we don't drive that frequently.
Right.
And so it is completely possible to own a car without having a level 2 charger that will charge the typical EV in about like overnight, basically. And because the city has been wise enough to set it so that you can charge, like if you charge overnight, it's literally cost me $3. We had actually considered getting something installed here, because when we bought our car, they would have installed something for us for free, a level 2 charger for free, or they would have given us a $750 credit on the flow system. And we looked at it, was like, it's actually going to be cheaper for us just to charge $3, because it would cost us like $8 to charge overnight. So we made the decision just not to do it, because we don't often park in front of our house anyways. It's totally possible to own a car without.
I'm in a condo with 600 parking spaces for 2 towers and 200 townhouses. We cannot convince the boards to put in a charging station. So we've been putting up for the last 6 months with, finding one down at the Mel Lastman Square that has multiple chargers available. And if you charge up overnight or on a weekend, it costs $6. So hard to beat that.
Peter, I'm surprised that your building couldn't put one in, because I'm in a tiny little building and we have 2, because we got, and basically we got it at about half price, because our management company found some terrific incentives.
I presented an outside solution where they wouldn't have had to pay anything, just give up whatever number of parking spots out of our visitor area. And the outside company basically charges the users and then pays for any hydro that was used each month. But I couldn't convince them just to make a change.
So one of the things that I've
charging in, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sam, go ahead.
So I'm just saying, one of the things that I've learned about campaigning is that there's a tendency, and I still do this on bad, tendency to assume that everyone who's not on your side is against you and they're not going to do anything. But there are ways of figuring out what the issues are and asking them, like, what is the problem? Why, like, just keep asking, and come with a mind of curiousness rather than of like, oh, I need to get. And then what I found when I talk to people that would sometimes be considered opponents is that you learn like what it is that the concerns are. And it's like, all right, well, if this is the concern, are there ways of dealing with those particular concerns? And so maybe the concern they have is like they don't want people to argue about who has a charging space or whatever, in which case then like, all right, well, here's a, maybe we need to put together a system, an organized system in order to do this. And it can take, years sometimes to do.
I haven't given up. We're still working on it.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to deal with the sort of space hog issue is we have a system. The system that we have for charging EV vehicles in the building is that if you leave it when it stopped drawing charge, then you actually end up paying a higher rate just to continue occupying the space when you're not drawing electricity. Then, so there's an incentive to go and move your car so that if somebody else needs to use the charger, they can use it. I mean, I'm surprised that they don't understand that that's going to increase the value and the attractiveness of the building, especially the way things are going.
And that's how I tried to sell it in the first place. But
yeah, so that tells me that the attractiveness of the resale of the building is not what's holding them back. That there's some other issue, at least one, if not several other issues that they're concerned about. And a lot of that is talking to folks, talking to the decision makers, figuring out who has that power, and then going like, all right, well, what are their concerns? What are their issues? And can we address those particular issues? And if not, then we're talking about a bigger campaign of changing the people who are in charge. And that is also doable within a condo because condos are elected boards.
I just had one more thing, Peter, before we are over 8:30 already, but I wanted, you were talking about stuff, things going on overnight and on weekends. And just this week, I learned that Toronto Hydro is putting that question out to people that you can opt to go on a much reduced rate for overnight or off peak. But it would mean that your mid-peak and your peak rates would go up. And so you can opt. It's an optional thing that you can go for this very, very cheap overnight rate or off peak rate. And the thing is that I just sort of learned about it. It hasn't, there wasn't an email sent out to Toronto Hydro customers or anything like that. It's been very, it's been strange that it hasn't really been pushed a little bit. I just wondered, How-Sen, whether this is something that the city or the T is promoting, saying, hey, this is a good idea, sign on to it if you because it encourages you to do things overnight, like, for example, putting your hot water on a timer so that you will heat it all night and then put it off in the morning and just draw on that hot water during the day, that kind of thing. And any feedback on that?
Yeah, so one of the that kind of pricing differential is perfect for things like batteries. And so the expectation is over the next 5 years or so that household batteries will become a thing. Household batteries will also become a thing in cars themselves. And so, for example, I'm not a big fan of pickup trucks, but one of the interesting things the F-150 Lightning is that it has a reversible battery, which means that you can power your house from the battery of the car. So the interesting things about vehicle-sized batteries is that they're about the same amount of energy inside that battery that you need to power a house for a couple of days. And that's an interesting thing. So I've heard of like people who have my EV, which is like a Chevy Bolt, which is like the cheapest EV that I could possibly find. in like parts of the world where they just found an inverter and are powering their house in like parts of the world where the electrical grid is not secure and is not running at a regular rate. And so we do expect that with more batteries, both grids level batteries, but also household sized batteries, that will also have an impact and a significant impact of smoothing out that energy demand curve that I mentioned at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And that would be really beneficial. And so pricing things that way is one of those steps necessary in order for us to encourage that kind of stuff. And so like batteries, you'll be hearing a lot more about batteries because lithium is one of the most plentiful minerals on planet Earth. And even though there absolutely are significant impacts in terms of mining impacts for that, it pales in comparison to the mining impacts that come out of fossil fuels, because the amount of volume you need to pull lithium out to power the entire planet is a fraction of the volume of mining waste that you produce pulling fossil fuels out of the ground.
Yeah, the other thing I've heard about batteries is that as they become unsuitable for cars, the batteries, or they end their useful life for cars, they then become very useful. They're still very useful on a household basis because there isn't the same kind of demand on them that you have, when you're trying to operate a vehicle. And so they're, that may be sort of these secondhand batteries can be very useful for storing power that is, generated at either better times or from a renewable source.
There are already companies that are producing grid level batteries that are just using old vehicle batteries, even old vehicle batteries from hybrid vehicles from before.
Oh, wow.
The issue isn't whether or not the batteries are still good. The issue primarily is the range in the batteries. As time goes on, the range decreases, and that matters when the goal is mobility. But when the goal is actually grid level and space, and the weight to space or the power to weight ratio doesn't matter as much, you can put it into some of these larger applications and use that to help power the grid and stuff. So there's a very exciting future in batteries. We do need more people working in that space. And that's, I think, another thing that I also want to emphasize as well, that oftentimes isn't talked about. So we don't necessarily, in Canada right now, have the workforce with the training necessary to do all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So the demand for people we need way more electricians and people who install heat pumps and stuff like that. We need more people who understand how to do carbon accounting, because a lot of like Toronto draws a lot of people, but I've been talking to other municipalities and their cities are struggling to do regular greenhouse gas inventory reports, even at that level. And so it's a significant challenge from that level in terms of training. It's one of the biggest potential opportunities in terms of economic gain is like the electrification and the decarbonization of our economy. It's an enormous opportunity, but we do need to make sure that we have the workforce trained to do that and the training for that. And that's one of the areas that we're going to have to spend a lot more time thinking of and finding solutions for the next several years and decades.
As a former guidance counselor, I would love to have somebody like you go to high schools and tell kids that. We are past 8:30. Does anybody have another question they'd like to squeeze in, or I think I would like to let How-Sen off the hook, because we did say 7 to 8:30 and it's now 8:41. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to just sort of throw in at the end? Okay. Well, How-Sen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been really interesting, and particularly that bit at the end about the batteries. That is really interesting. So thank you very much, and especially because I know you said yes without too much time in front of you. It was sort of almost last minute, not quite, but I think it was just last week that we nailed you down. So I really appreciate you joining and agreeing to come and talk to us and answer our questions.
Thank you.
Come visit us at torontoenvironment.org. Sign up to our newsletter. You can get more stuff. If you have any other community events that you want speakers on this, you've had Emily on speaking with your community before. We're happy to come and talk some more. Thanks so much for your interest. Thanks so much for listening. I do tend to babble on at times, and I do like the sound of my own voice.
And maybe I could just objectively say that Toronto Environment Alliance is, I guess it's a not-for-profit organization. And they do live off of philanthropic care. So without having How-Sen have to say that, I'll say it for them.
Yeah, no, I think I should have said that. Thank you, David. We've been supporters of tea for a long time now, and I'd say they're a really good, a good place to put some of your dollars if you've got some to just support some of their initiatives. Okay, well, thanks very much. And so next week we do have somebody from Transform TO, and I've forgotten his name right now. All right,
his name's Chaim Koff.
Sorry,
his name is
right.
Chaim
Yes.
Koff.
And the focus will be on buildings, and so there will be some overlap with what we were talking about tonight, I think. But we may not. We may have a whole bunch of new people as well, because we're hoping that the promotion will be, continuing and buzz. So by all means, talk to other people at your churches, and we'll see if we can get some more people out each time. And then on May 24th, there's a miss. So May the 17th, there is nothing, and then May 24th, we have Diane Sachs talking about transportation. And that was her choice when I actually asked her for suggestions of people. And she said, well, I'll do the transportation one. Okay, that's great. And she has spoken at our church a couple of times because it is in her she is a counselor for Rosedale United. Anyway, that is the series. I hope you are able to come to either all three or as many as you can. And by all means, do talk to others about it, and talk to other people about things like heat pumps and, because I know our next door neighbor had never even heard of it when we put our sign up saying that this is what we'd done. So it's a good idea to just spread the message. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.